All right, guys. Thank you so much for being here tonight. So my name is Brad Nanna, and tonight my breakout is, does science make a case for God? So I'm going to kind of answer two questions right off the bat before we actually hop into that. And those big questions are kind of what my goal is for this discussion, for this breakout, and why I'm the one leading it. Because those are kind of two things to understand and know to make the rest of it important. So the first part is, what's the goal? What is my, if best case scenario, everybody walks out of here with? What is that? So for me, I'm not trying to absolutely have everybody walk out of here saying, I can prove God exists, prove it by using science. That, I want us to kind of take that off the board because I don't think that's what we're going to get talking tonight. And there's PhDs who are still doing the research and doing the studies and still finding out more information. So I would say that that is part of having a faith, is that we don't have 100% proof, especially on the scientific realm, especially when it comes to things like creation, where we actually will never experience and have never experienced what that looked like in that scenario. So that, I want to take that off the board. But what I do want to do is open our perspective. That's kind of the goal tonight, because a lot of times, especially, and I'm not trying to take any shots or anything, but in public schools, public colleges, and all that kind of stuff, you are getting a one-sided or you're getting an assumed education when it comes to science. A lot of our textbooks, a lot of our professors, even when they're teaching, if they're not talking about evolution or the age of the earth and that kind of stuff, it is assumed in what they are teaching. You really can't read through a scientific textbook from high school on without the underlying assumption of the theory of evolution being true, basically. So that's kind of, I want to take us into a realm that many of us may have not thought about of, okay, here's the holes, or here's some questions that we might not know to ask based off of what the theory of evolution, the age of the earth, all that kind of stuff, that actually help us understand this is bigger than what they say. Like, there are actually questions, less answers, and they can't just make a statement that this is true, because there are still things that they can't answer on that side. So that's number one. And then number two, I do want to make this case for God of, really the big one is design and creationism versus evolution. So that's the way I'm going to go. So that's kind of the what and the why of tonight. Why me is the next question. So I am only 28 years old, but I actually did not start out my education trying to be a pastor. So I am the Fuse pastor here at Ignite Church. So I lead our college and young adult 18 to 25-year-olds in ministry, and it is absolutely one of the best things I get to do. Obviously, outside of being a husband and a father to my 1-year-old baby girl that we had just last year. But my background before that, I'm actually by training a cellular and molecular biologist. So that was actually my career before stepping into doing ministry. So I got my degree in that. So I had all the OChems, the genetics. I actually worked in our genetics lab at the University of Liberty. And then after that, I transitioned to the University of Pittsburgh, where I worked in a microevolution lab with one of the most brilliant minds I've ever come across. And his name was Dr. Eric. I'm not going to give his last name just because we're recording this, and I don't know if he'd want to be connected with what we're doing tonight, unfortunately. But this man, when I tell you, he was a scientific genius, but also was open-minded like nobody else that I'd met in that realm. It was the most beautiful thing that I got to experience, because we would read books. We were in microevolution lab studying antibiotic resistance. That was specifically what I was doing, the evolution of bacteria becoming resistant to the drugs that we used to kill them. That was my research. We would read books on these things, and when these books would assume things or make assumptions or have explanations, he would either say, yes, like this is a really good, well-founded study, but a lot of times he'd come in and he would say, they're making it seem like they have a lot more answers than they really do, or this is their explanation in this. And he, from my understanding, was not a Jesus follower or believer. He was just somebody who did hold high truth and thought through things, and he would straight up call out some scientific research. He would call out assumptions that were being made in the book, and that was great for me to see from the non-Christian perspective that, it's not just this like, Christians are anti-science and the scientists are pro-science and anti-Christianity. That's not the case, and that doesn't need to be the case, because they actually do go hand in hand. So that's why I'm here tonight. I should get to talk about some things that I love to talk about that I don't get to talk about nearly enough. So I'm very excited. But yeah, my research was specifically in staph, so Staphylococcus aureus. Anybody here heard of MRSA? Ever had a staph infection? Yeah? So MRSA is methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. We're not getting into all of it, but I was basically working on the next step that it took in its evolution, where it also became vancomycin-resistant, which is the next drug that they usually use. So there were only like 11 cases in America at that point because it was so rare. So it was resistant against like multiple antibiotics that they use against it. So that's my research, that's my background. They're actually publishing, I was recently published last year in a communications journal through NCBI, I believe, was the publication company or firm that it went through. So, and then they're still working on the project. It's a long-term project that I started back when I was still there. So that's my background. I don't want to use too much time other than that. I do want to pray, and then we're going to hop into it. So let's pray. God, I thank you for tonight. I thank you for these men. God, I thank you that this church tonight is filled with men, because one of the scariest things that we can see is when churches stop being filled with men. On Sundays and in ministries and in groups, God, like that would be the devil winning. And we do not want that, God. I pray for all these men in this room that we would stay strong. For the fathers, that we would set a standard, that we would show our kids what it means to follow you, to love you, and to be your disciple. For our wives, what it looks like to be loved in the way that a groom loves a bride, just like you love us. And just for men in general, that we would understand you better. That we would open our minds to see your truths, not just in the Bible, but also in science that shows us and points us to this thing that, hey, there is a God that we can believe in and that we trust, and maybe here's some reasons why we can believe that. So God, I pray tonight that we would learn, that we would have our perspective grow, but even more than that, that we would just commit to loving you more and to knowing more about you, God. That's the goal, and that's the reason that we're here, God. We thank you for what you did on the cross, for your son dying on the cross, and without him, this all would be mute, God. So I just pray that we would all just take this time and really dig in, meet the guys around us, create brotherhoods that lead us to be better, stronger men for Christ, and that we honor and glorify you in all we say we do. And it's your name we pray. And everybody said? Amen. Awesome. Thank you guys so much. So, yeah, the name of the breakout is there a scientific case for God? If you want a quick answer to that, what my goal is to say, yes, there is a scientific case. Maybe not 100% proof, that's not what we're doing, but is there a case? And we're just gonna kind of walk through things that point in that direction. So the first thing that we're gonna talk to, when I was thinking how I wanted to go through this, I wanted to come from a singular perspective. I wanted us all to be looking through the same lens as we walk down the road of looking at science, and specifically a lot of creation and creationism in this time. And the lens that I decided to go through was time. Time is going to be the lens that we are looking through things, because for the most part, and I don't mean this critically to my scientific brothers and sisters in the field, but time can be used often like a magic wand in science. If you just wave this magic wand of 1 billion years or millions of years, then eventually it can happen. Or it will happen, and they're not doing it with that purpose, but what they have done is they've created this instance where time is a necessity. For the most part, in scientific research and study, especially on evolution and creationism, like time, and a lot of it is mandatory. So that's the idea of time is the MVP, one of the MVPs of scientific explanation. And we're gonna get into some of the areas where it's used, and sometimes I think used poorly. But I wanted to get to this. We're going to kind of start in Genesis 1, because I want to take the theistic creation, so biblical creationism, where God designed and created the earth. And then I want to take kind of scientific creation of evolution, if you want to put that there, is probably the better words. For theistic creation, you can have, and I say can, I do think that one instance in one case is stronger than the other, but you can have both an old earth perspective if you want to, if you research that, or a young earth perspective. Obviously you can't have both. The earth is either going to be old or young. But in creationism, in theistic creation, there is enough room to believe in both. And I kind of want to walk through that. So most of us in here have read Genesis and Creation Week, and that's what we call it, Creation Week, because we have the 6 days of creation where God created everything, and on the 7th day of rest. And in that week, specifically in Genesis 1, there is room to create a period of existing time outside of just 7 days. So the two theories that we are going to be talking about, if you want to write them down, let me see if no, they're not on here, are the gap theory is one, and the day-age theory is another. Those are just the two that we're going to be kind of looking at tonight, and I'll kind of explain what that is. So the gap theory, if you look in Genesis 1, it's this idea that between Genesis 1, verse 1 and verse 2, there's actually a large gap of time. That's the gap theory. So I'll kind of just read those two verses. So I'm reading Genesis 1 in the ESV translation, and it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the earth." So gap theory says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the end of the first verse. And then there's a large gap of time, but where then the earth was formed and without form and void. And the gap theory would state that things were created. There was this almost pre-Genesis 1:2, verse 2, earth, and then there's a lot of things that they say could happen, and one of the strongest ones that I do see is that is actually when, between verses 1 and 2, the devil went against God. When you see Lucifer go against God, and this fall of the angels, and when that happened in this long period of extended time, like at that same point, destruction came upon what was already there, and it became without form and void. So that is the gap theory. That's just one of the examples, but really what it's saying is that's one of the things that could happen. What it's saying is it doesn't necessarily have to go from he created it and now immediately he was over it the next day. I'm not a gap theory strong believer. That's just a personal study of mine. I'm actually a young earther. I'll just be very front with you guys. But that is a standing theory that does have holes. Everything we talk about tonight will have arguments and counter arguments. So I do recommend going back and studying those. But that was kind of the summation of the gap theory. The next is the day-age theory. This one many of you may have actually heard of, where the days in creation week are not literal days. So that actually comes from later in the Bible, talking about how a day, like how God's time is different than our time. A day in God's time is 1,000 years in ours, vice versa and whatnot. So that what they say is that the days in Genesis 1, where he's creating, days 1 and even through 7, did not have to be 24-hour spans. There is room for that based off of study, like we said, of God's time, his experience, millennia being a day and vice versa. I do not also stand with that, and I'll actually tell you the counter argument for that is that when you actually go back to the original writings, it used the word day. And that's like very front and foremost. There were words that they could have used there instead of day, that we knew it, that it was known back then. There was words for longer periods of time, and they did not decide to use those. They used the word day all through Genesis 1. And for me, like just reading the Bible, I don't think that if they were long periods of time, that God would confuse us, that they would purposely be allowed to be in his scripture. That's just my stance. Like, again, there is room for it, but that's my counter argument for that. And then obviously the last one is young earth. So this is, if you want to erase this idea of the earth is billions of years old, and you believe when you read the account of Genesis and you actually read through the lineages, that you can actually find in the Bible the lineages from Adam to Jesus, add up the time frames of the ages and whatnot, and you can find the earth and you can say, okay, this is about how old the earth is. It changes every once in a while, but it's somewhere now, I think, between the 6,000 to 8,000 year range. Jason, I'm just wondering because you're here, that's about correct. Sometimes up to 12 is another one, but yeah, so somewhere in that range. And that lines a lot better up with the lineages of the Bible when you go that way. So, but why is this important? Because scientists have to have it. They have to. If you're a long-term macroevolutionist where you had a single-celled unicellular organism become human beings are here tonight, the evolution theory states, like the necessity, doesn't state it, but it creates a necessity for old Earth. So I just wanted to get that and say that is actually way bigger for scientists. They have to have it than Christians. It's not if it's old or young, it absolutely erases everything that we believe. For scientists, especially evolutionists, it would basically erase their running theory of evolution, Darwin's theory of evolution. So that's kind of the beginning. So that's kind of just going through time. So this lens of time, the first thing, the case that I want to make, the case that is made, it's also, if you want to write this down, the more scholastic term for it is the teleological argument. So, but it is basically the fine-tuned universe. So what do I mean by the fine-tuned universe? Do we have any mechanics, car guys, anything like that in the room? We have a couple of them. I am not that. So I'm gonna do my best, but I wanna let you all know that that is not my background. But I want us to think about our cars and how we get in them, we put the key in the ignition, and we don't really think about what else is happening. We just start to drive. It clicks on, we put it in drive, and we go. But that mechanism of our automobiles, specifically our engines, transmissions, and all that kind of stuff, there is an extreme amount of fine-tuning, of necessity that is needed to get that initial, the ignition, that spark to turn into power, to a combustion to turn into power, to move the cylinders, to then change into mechanical twisting of the wheels so that we can actually drive our cars. So they have to be fine-tuned. For example, I just talking about going with the cars, there has to be intake. The air and the gasoline, or the air and the fuel, have to mix so that there's something that can ignite. If there's not enough air, there won't be an ignition, there won't be anything to actually create that combustion. If there's not enough fuel, there's nothing to combust. So that's intake. It has to be very specifically then pressed together, a compression of those two things to get the mixture. So compression is when it is actually brought into the cylinder. After that, you have the combustion, which then pops the cylinder and creates this up and down motion. And then even from there, you have to have the exhaust. What is in that currently is now burnt fuel. There's no more energy, there's no more combustion that can happen with that stuff. It has to go out the exhaust, the new air and the new gasoline, or the new gasoline for most of our cars mixture has to come in, and it has to do it, and it has to keep burning. If it were just stuck in there, burning would stop and you wouldn't have any more combustion and power to go through. Our universe is extremely fine-tuned, meaning there are very specifics that allow us to be alive, to allow us to experience this earth, and even for this earth to exist. And so the big three that I have here are gravity, nuclear forces, and positioning. So these three things, these constants that happen here, there's a gravitational constant, is extremely important that it is as strong as it is, no stronger and not any weaker. If gravity was actually weaker than it is, then we would actually not have any life-sustaining planets. Our planet would not be as condensed as it is, and we would not be able to actually sustain life in it. Our ozone would be messed up, and we wouldn't be able to have the greenhouse gases and hold and all that kind of stuff to actually heat us. So gravity would mess up a ton of that. Also, stars. The gravity that happens in our universe, if the gravity was any weaker, that's what we're talking about, weaker than it is, then you actually would not have this burning, this yellow sun that we have, the star that heats us and gives us light. And then on the other side, if it was too strong, you would actually condense the stars and you would burn them up too quickly. So our sun, instead of having it last and us being able to live, if gravity was stronger, it would have condensed it and it would have burnt out a long time ago. And therefore, without the sun, none of us would have life, obviously, and there would be no life on Earth. And the same thing goes with if gravity was too strong on the Earth, it would be too condensed and we would not be able to survive. So it is an extremely fine-tuned mechanism, constant, that you actually have to either take one way. Was it random? Was it just chance? Or was it designed? Or we'll get into the third one. Is there a lot of different tests, kind of any Marvel people in here, superheroes? There's actually a theory of multiversal happening. So many different scenarios are happening all at the same time in different levels and different planes. And we are just experiencing the one that has been successful. But we'll get into that and how at that time, or for that case, all you're doing is saying, oh, you have a lot of time, because you can do it over and over and over and over again across the different planes until you get it right. So that's gravity, for example, fine-tuned universe. Nuclear forces, this comes into a lot of chemistry. So if your nuclear forces are what hold your nucleus of your atoms, is what we'll look at tonight specifically together. So your neutrons and your protons. And there are two forces there that play a massive part. One is called nuclear forces, the strong and the weak nuclear forces, and the other is electromagnetism. So if anybody, hopefully we remember this from our school days, protons are positive, neutrons are neutral, positive and positive don't want to go together. So electromagnetism actually pushes them apart. But we actually have these other forces called nuclear forces, specifically with the neutrons as well, that comes in, and it's because it is a stronger force, it is able to take the pressure of electromagnetism, and it's able to bind and hold that nucleus together. It creates a better structure and system so that our nucleuses of our atoms, down to the atomic level, can actually occur. If you had stronger nuclear forces, if things were held together tighter, all the hydrogen in the universe would have burnt up. It actually would have turned into helium. It would be brought together. You'd actually have more neutrons and protons come together, and it would have turned into helium. And we kind of need hydrogen for, things like water, H2O, 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen. Think if there was no H atoms in the universe on our planet, it wouldn't work. If it was too weak, then none of our atoms would actually hold together. The nucleus would fly apart, the electrons would fly apart, and we would not be able to build blocks based off the atomic level to the things like carbon, which we are all carbon-based life forms and whatnot. So those are nuclear forces that are extremely fine-tuned for our universe. And finally, positioning. This one is a little bit more popular, and you kind of just see it different places, social medias and on the news and whatnot, but it is extremely important. The positioning of our planet to the sun. Like if we were just a little bit off 5%, I think is what they believe. If we were 5% closer to the sun, we would have the same temperatures and atmospheric understandings as Venus, which Venus gets up to 900 degrees. So think about that. We would not survive that, and that's all positioning. If you were 5% further, you would have massive glacier movements and basically a frozen Earth, and therefore life would not exist either. And these are just examples, but I say this because these should, and what I want them to do is make us ask questions. Like scientists want to give you answers and make you think that they have all the answers a lot of the time, and it's not on purpose, but that is how we are training up science at this point. It's how I was trained up, when there's actually times when there's really good questions that they can't answer that show. So their example, why? What is the likelihood that all these different mechanisms, like in the car, the literally hundreds, if not thousands of mechanisms that are what we experience, work together to create life and sustain life the way that they currently do? When you actually look at it, I think the last time somebody did a statistical analysis, which you have to kind of take with a grain of salt because you're taking some assumptions in these things because they're such small and there's so many of them, it was something like 1 × 10 to the 54th chances. So 10 or 1 with 54 zeros after it, a 1 in that many. So it's kind of like, I was looking at, somebody was explaining it, and I really liked it. It's like when you get a royal flush when you're playing poker, and it's like you got a royal flush almost every single time you played poker. One time it's gonna happen, but 1 × 10 to the 54th chance, that's gonna happen, that's what it's kind of looking like. So the idea here is, okay, then why? How did we, what are the chances and what does that mean? So the one example that they have is honestly just, it is random. It was just a draw in the hat, and that when the Big Bang happened and creation happened, that it was just, the luckiest scenario happened, and humanity and life formed universe, a life-sustaining universe was formed. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on that, although that is a pretty predominant, people say there doesn't need to be a reason, it just is. That is literally the answer that people will give. The next part is design. So this is where, when you start asking these questions, you should be asking, you wouldn't expect to find a watch in the forest and be like, oh yeah, this watch, it just grew here. It's too specific, it's too designed. You open the watch face and you have all the moving parts and the moving dials, and it's like, why would we not expect that when we see a watch in the woods, yet when we see the earth and the universe and the life-sustaining things, people can still say, oh yeah, it just happened without a designer. That is that idea of the case for God. It's, for some reason, in small instances, we'd say, oh, that's designed. But when we look at our universe, we don't say it's designed, and that is the case. And finally, I talked about it, the multiverse, where this is very theoretical physics. And it's the string theory, if anybody wants to look that up. I'm not a physicist or a chemist, I'm a biologist. So it's a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, but basically it's like Marvel, where you have all these planes that are happening all at the same time of existence. So our universe, and there's a bunch of them, and then we ask these questions because we're the one that worked. And what they're doing is they're just taking as many possibilities, as many times as they can, and they're saying, okay, if you do that across the board, you'll find the one that worked. And it's that's where you have to ask them. It's do you Does that make sense? Like you start to ask those questions, because to me, especially like in scientific and Christianity background, like I can't come away with that and not at least say, hey, there's a case here. Again, case for God. There's a case for an intelligent design. Again, after that, you have to get into the more apologetics of, okay, well, what makes God, the Christian God, the God who did that, but that's not what we're doing today. We're making the case for God. And then there's other reasons, and Mason's going to be doing a study on, okay, and does studies on the rest of why is this the one that we believe. So that's kind of the time in the fine-tuned universe. The next, and this is where my background is more, it's time and life. And I just kind of wanted to take time, aka like that. I wanted to take time to look at this and to kind of answer some holes that we don't hear, or some misconceptions that are taught, either accidentally or sometimes on purpose, that we walk away from. So the first thing is mutation. So to have life, to have where we got from, if you believe that the single-celled organism to the humans that are in this room, you had to have mutations in DNA along the way. You see this in things like dogs and all that kind of stuff, where there are slight mutations in the DNA that happen, and they're building and they're going the direction. You kind of see, have you guys ever seen the picture of, you have the single-celled organism, then you have like the animal on all fours, and then you have it like slowly stand up, and by the end of the picture, it's wearing a suit and tie walking out like a man. So it's kind of that idea of mutation took us there, DNA mutation, which is true. There is DNA mutation, but I want us to know it's not directional. Like there is no thinking process behind DNA mutation for the most part in this way, as like, you know what? The DNA is not saying, you know, it would be a little bit better for me if I could have a little bit more oxygen. So I'm going to change my DNA, and now I'm going to be able to intake more oxygen. There is none of that. It's not this directional process. For the most part, what mutation in the DNA comes from is stress or pressure, and it's actually negative effects, and it's a survival of our bodies. It will just start throwing DNA down and replicating it in a certain way to allow for more changes in DNA. And it doesn't happen in us as much as it does when you look at the unicellular into the multicellular beginning organisms. But it will start to do that to save itself, that maybe, just maybe, it will come up with something that helps it survive. So back to my background of antibiotic resistance, we start with Staphylococcus aureus, a bacteria. It started getting killed with methicillin, which is a antibiotic. So from there, what was happening was all the bacteria, Staphylococcus aureus, that was being killed was not resistant. And in that time, there was pressure. The bacteria was feeling it, and its DNA, RNA, could replicate, and it could create holes, and it would be fixed in the incorrect way, but hoping that it would come up with a survival instinct, and it did. You have microevolution of antibiotic resistance, but here's the thing, and this is where it gets into the second part, it's not innately advantageous. Like if you actually study the replication rates and the growth rates of these antibiotic-resistant bacteria, there's a payoff of they don't get killed by methicillin, or my example of they don't get killed by vancomycin, but they do not replicate nearly as fast. Meaning they can't outcompete all the normal Staphylococcus aureus that is happening inside or happening around it, and they die off based off competition instead of by antibiotics. So it's only when you hit a gut with these antibiotics that the antibiotic-resistant bacteria are able to thrive and survive. But here's the thing, so science would have to tell you that life is innately, the mutation in evolution was always going a direction. It was gonna go to be where it is now, and it was seeking advantageous effects. And that's just not how at a base level the science works. That's not how at a base level DNA replication and mutation works. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there, because that is a big misconception that when you just study science, it's like, oh yeah, and then things mutate so they get better. And it's kind of the superhero Darwin, if anybody's ever seen that Marvel movie. It's the origins, and his body basically reacts to whatever's going on to survive it better. And that's the way that a lot of times we're taught or made to think about mutation, and it's just not the case. So after that, so that's the basics of evolution. Now we're gonna get into evolution. Two big categories here: microevolution, macroevolution. I want us to delineate them, and I actually want us to look at them because there's a big difference. I actually believe that micro is with our just basic faith of the Bible is acceptable and even biblical, found in the Bible. And I think there's some serious problems with macro, which is that idea of single-celled or different species turning into different species over a long period of time. And I think that one's problematic. So to look at microevolution, that is what I was talking about when I talked about the bacteria. It wasn't turning from, a bacteria to a human. It was turning from a bacteria with a certain characteristic to the same bacteria, just with a new characteristic, microevolution. It's the fact that its DNA either already had in it and just needed stressors, or created a new way of replicating and had a new DNA cursor in it that made it resistant. And I think that we actually see the Bible talk about this idea of, hey, dogs. We all agree that dogs are all related, the species of a dog. It's the idea of, okay, you can have microevolutions in that. Your German Shepherd and your what's the small one, Wiener dog, I forget the actual Dachshund or whatever it's called, they are related. They come from this idea of an ancestor. So we'll talk about that real quick, and that comes from Genesis 6, verse 18 and 20, when it's talking about the flood. So we'll hop into that real quick. So Genesis 6, verses 18 through 20, it says, "But I will establish my covenant with you, God, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you, and every living thing of all flesh you shall bring two of every sort." Another says two of every kind, two of every sort, every kind, into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. So I want to kind of talk about when we think of the ark. A lot of the times we're like, oh, Noah had to get two of every single animal on earth into the ark so they could survive. But biblically, it actually uses the word sort or kind, and what I believe, and I think microevolution would agree with, is he only had to get the pinnacle or the overarching family of that animal. So instead of having a German Shepherd and a Golden Retriever and a Poodle, it was, okay, I need a kind of dog. The old school, whatever the original, before they've kind of even micro-evolved or characteristics into different ones, I need a dog on the ark. I need a cat on the ark. I need name some other animals, I need an elephant on the ark, and so on. I don't need all of them. So from there, it kind of creates this idea of bushes instead of this massive tree that has one root in one animal. So you'd have dogs on the ark, and then from the ark after that, they could then return into the different dog species all coming off it. So this is the idea of where it creates this bush from. Cat, same thing. Elephant, same thing. I don't even know. I guess there are a few different elephants and whatnot. But that's that idea of the Bible actually giving credence to microevolution, to these slight differences that lead to different speciation or different types of dog, cat, elephant, whatnot, but not the jump from dog to cat, which we have seen now in like the liger, or I forget what the other version of that is called, but that's not able to replicate, like it's not able to reproduce, which then it shows too, like that was not evolution into a new thing, that was a forced scientific experiment, and honestly at the end of the day also had very bad effects on the animal, like it's a very unhealthy animal the vast majority of the time. So that's microevolution. Macroevolution. So that's when we talk about that single cell walking and turning into a human. I want to talk about some of the problems that we don't know about, that evolutionary scientists don't talk about, but do exist. And the first one is it up there? Yeah, irreducible complexity. So irreducible complexity, if you want to look this up, Michael Behe, he was the scientist, the PhD, who actually came up with this research. And he was studying different biochemistry biochemical systems, as well as structures. And he looked at them, and specifically the bacterial flagella is the one that he looked at and how complex it is. But in our case, we're going to look at the mousetrap. It is not a perfect example. There's counter arguments to the mousetrap. Do not get caught up on the mousetrap itself, but get caught up on what it's saying. So what he said is there are things that are so complex, that have so many moving parts all working together, that it could not have been this step-by-step from this is a simple mousetrap, to, this is a more complex mousetrap, to, this is even more complex, because it was already too complex to start with. The things that were already needed to start, it could not be so irreducible. You couldn't take it and then work backwards from it of, hey, if I took this piece out of a mousetrap, if you took the spring out of a mousetrap, you no longer have a mousetrap, you have a paperweight. Like that trap is not going to fly over and catch the mousetrap. If you take the base off of the mousetrap, you're not going to have it attached to anything. So there's never going to be, it's this idea of you cannot reduce the mousetrap to a simpler form. Again, it's not a perfect one because the mousetrap is simpler than the bacterial flagella. So the bacteria, the way they move, they have basically a very even more designed and better functioning version of our propellers in our boats. And that's how they move. And it takes 40 plus specific proteins to build that. And every single one of those is crucial. And without one of them, it starts to break down rapidly and does not function. So he looked at that and he said, yeah, you can't go from step 1 and then add one thing to step 2 and add one thing to step 3 and add one thing, these little small evolutionary steps, and get to the final process, because all of these things, all these additions that are here are needed. It's irreducibly complex. You can't do it. So it's a big hole in evolutionary theory. And what it says is, okay, maybe it had to start like that. And maybe it started at a form, but either way, there's a design that goes to it. And evolution does not want to say that there's a hole in the evolutionary theory that you can't go back until you reach the original function. So that is irreducible complexity. You also have missing links. So this is more paleontology. So if you ever want to, Dr. Marcus Ross was my professor at Liberty University. Brilliant mind, paleontologist. And if you guys have probably seen the fossil record, and a lot of times every decade or so, it'll be like, oh, we found the missing link between apes and humans. And that's been happening for generations. And we have a huge fossil record. And to be honest, even the apes to humans is not settled. The vast majority, not vast majority, but a lot of scientists, paleontologists specifically, even when they see those ones that look like they could be more ape-like, they take that as just different characteristics based off of the area that human lived at that time. So there are obviously advantageous things for reproduction and whatnot that choose for it and pass it down. So what they would say is that wasn't actually this in-between human and ape. That was a human who, the characteristics of the people, like if we go to, even in the Bible, the Jews during Jesus' time, the average height of somebody from Jerusalem, I believe, was between 5 foot and 5'4". Like, it's like, yeah, Jason says, amen. Yeah. But, so it's kind of that idea of, in different pockets of the same species, you can have different physical characteristics. We see that in America versus Asia versus Europe versus Africa. That is still happening. What they'll do with the fossil record is they'll find something that looks like it can fit in between, instead of saying, oh, that's a human that just had a characteristic of a stronger jaw or a longer brow or something like that. They'll try and put a stamp of missing link. And even if they do that with humans, you should have missing links throughout the fossil record. Like if everything went back to a single cellular organism, you should be able to see like a lot, and yes, not all fossils exist. They have to happen in a very specific way. You have to have quick, most of the time, coverage of a dead animal, or it has to die in a certain thing. But you should be able to find way more of these missing links than we have in science and in paleontology. So again, it goes back to, let's break down the case of science has all the answers, evolution and all that kind of stuff, and start making the questions that make people think, yeah, my thinking is off. And then the final one that we aren't even going to talk about, but it's obviously the biggest one, is abiogenesis, which if you want in layman's terms, it's nothing living to living things. Like even the theory of evolution, it's trying to explain how we got from the basics of life to where we are now. It does not explain how life began in the first place, where it came from. They just try to jump to the Big Bang Theory and then everything forming and then evolution taking us to where it is. Science still does not really, they try to attempt, but not even in a good way, how that started, and that's a massive hole that they just want to jump over. So it's like when you start to build these questions, build these understandings up, and I know this was kind of an in-depth talk. It's been a while since I got to talk about this. But when you just start seeing, oh, there are holes, or oh, this does look like when we would see it in real life, like something designed it, you start to build this case of maybe science doesn't have all the answers. What else is out there? Okay, there is this Bible, there is this God who there's actually a lot of apologetics and a lot of research and a lot of study done that makes a good case for it, not just in science, but in history and all that kind of stuff. So that's what kind of all the time that we had today. I just wanted to throw all that out there. I will have time to talk. I know I talk fast, and that was a lot, but really at the end of the day, make sure to ask questions. Science is going to have you assume things, or they're going to assume things and not even tell you. Start to ask the questions, look into it, and realize that science will tell you they have everything, and really at the end of the day, they don't. So thank you guys so much. Y'all can go ahead and head out. Yeah.